Chapter 6 of The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 6. Narrated by Gesine. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 6. The Flight of the Midgets. Cap'n Bill and Trot rode very comfortably in the sunbonnet. The motion was quite steady, for they weighed so little that the auk flew without effort. Yet they were both somewhat nervous about their future fate, and could not help wishing they were safe on land and their natural size again.
"You're terrible small, Trot,"
remarked Cap'n Bill, looking at his companion.
"Same to you, Captain,"
she said with a laugh.
"But as long as we have the purple berries, we needn't worry about our size."
"In a circus,"
mused the old man,
"we'd be curiosities. But in a sunbonnet, high up in the air, sailing over a big unknown ocean, they ain't no word in any booktionary to describe us."
"Why, we're midgets, that's all,"
said the little girl. The auk flew silently for a long time. The slight swaying of the sunbonnet made Cap'n Bill drowsy, and he began to doze. Trot, however, was wide awake, and after enduring the monotonous journey as long as she was able, she called out,
"Don't you see land anywhere, Mr. Orc?"
"Not yet,"
he answered.
"This is a big ocean, and I've no idea in which direction the nearest land to that island lies, but if I keep flying in a straight line, I'm sure to reach some place sometime."
That seemed reasonable. So the little people in the sunbonnet remained as patient as possible. That is, Cap'n Bill dozed, and Trot tried to remember her geography lessons so she could figure out what land they were likely to arrive at. For hours and hours the auk flew steadily, keeping to the straight line and searching with his eyes the horizon of the ocean for land. Cap'n Bill was fast asleep and snoring, and Trot had laid her head on his shoulder to rest it, when suddenly the auk exclaimed,
"There! I've caught a glimpse of land at last!"
At this announcement they roused themselves. Cap'n Bill stood up and tried to peek over the edge of the sunbonnet.
"What does it look like?"
he inquired.
"Looks like another island,"
said the auk.
"but I can judge it better in a minute or two."
"I don't care much for islands since we visited that other one,"
declared Trot. Soon the auk made another announcement.
"It is surely an island, and a little one, too,"
said he.
"but I won't stop because I see a much bigger land straight ahead of it."
"That's right,"
approved Cap'n Bill.
"The bigger the land, the better it will suit us."
"It's almost a continent,"
continued the auk after a brief silence, during which he did not decrease the speed of his flight.
"I wonder if it can be Orkland, the place I've been seeking so long."
"I hope not,"
whispered Trot to Cap'n Bill, so softly that the auk could not hear her.
"for I shouldn't like to be in a country where only orcs live. This one orc isn't a bad companion, but a lot of him wouldn't be much fun."
After a few more minutes of flying, the auk called out in a sad voice,
"No, this is not my country. It's a place I have never been before. Although I have wandered far and wide, it seems to be all mountains and deserts and green valleys and queer cities and lakes and rivers, mixed up in a very puzzling way."
"Most countries are like that,"
commented Cap'n Bill.
"Are you going to land?"
"Pretty soon,"
was the reply.
"There is a mountain peak just ahead of me. What do you say to our landing on that?"
"All right,"
agreed the sailor-man, for both he and Trot were getting tired of riding in the sunbonnet and longed to set foot on solid ground again. So in a few minutes the auk slowed down his speed, and then came to a stop so easily that they were scarcely jarred at all. Then the creature squatted down until the sunbonnet rested on the ground, and began trying to unfasten with its claws the knotted strings. This proved a very clumsy task, because the strings were tied to the back of the auk's neck, just where his claws would not easily reach. After much fumbling, he said,
"I'm afraid I can't let you out, and there is no one near to help me."
This was at first discouraging, but after a little thought, Cap'n Bill said,
"If you don't mind, Trot, I can cut a slit in your sunbonnet with my knife."
"Do,"
she replied.
"The slit won't matter, 'cause I can sew it up again afterward when I'm big."
So Cap'n Bill got out his knife, which was just as small in proportion as he was, and after considerable trouble managed to cut a long slit in the sunbonnet. First he squeezed through the opening himself, and then helped Trot to get out. When they stood on firm ground again, their first act was to begin eating the dark purple berries which they had brought with them. 2 of these Trot had guarded carefully during their long journey, by holding them in her lap, for their safety meant much to the tiny people.
"I'm not very hungry,"
said the little girl as she handed a berry to Cap'n Bill.
"but hunger doesn't count in this case. It's like taking medicine to make you well, so we must manage to eat 'em somehow or other."
But the berries proved quite pleasant to taste, and as Cap'n Bill and Trot nibbled at their edges, their forms began to grow in size, slowly but steadily. The bigger they grew, the easier it was for them to eat the berries, which of course became smaller to them, and by the time the fruit was eaten, our friends had regained their natural size. The little girl was greatly relieved when she found herself as large as she had ever been, and Cap'n Bill shared her satisfaction, for, although he had seen the effect of the berries on the orc, they had not been sure the magic fruit would have the same effect on human beings, or that the magic would work in any other country than that in which the berries grew.
"What shall we do with the other 4 berries?"
asked Trot, as she picked up her sunbonnet, marvelling that she had ever been small enough to ride in it.
"They're no good to us now, are they, Cap?"
"I'm not sure as to that,"
he replied.
"If they were eaten by one who had never eaten the lavender berries, they might have no effect at all. But then, contrariwise, they might. One of 'em has got badly jammed, so I'll throw it away. But the other 3 I believe I'll carry with me. They're magic things, you know, and may come handy to us sometime."
He now searched in his big pocket and drew out a small wooden box with a sliding cover. The sailor had kept an assortment of nails of various sizes in his box, but those he now dumped loosely into his pocket, and in the box placed the 3 sound purple berries. When this important matter was attended to, they found time to look about them and see what sort of place the orc had landed them in. End of chapter 6.
The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 7. The Bumpy Man. Narrated by Kelly Harmon, Boone, North Carolina. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum. The mountain on which they had alighted was not a barren waste, but had on its sides patches of green grass, some bushes, a few slender trees, and here and there masses of tumbled rocks. The sides of the slope seemed rather steep, but with care one could climb up or down them with ease and safety. The view from where they now stood showed pleasant valleys and fertile hills lying below the heights. Trot thought she saw some houses of queer shapes scattered about the lower landscape, and there were moving dots that might be people or animals, yet were too far away for her to see them clearly. Not far from the place where they stood was the top of the mountain, which seemed to be flat, so the orc proposed to his companions that he would fly up and see what was there.
"That's a good idea,"
said Trot.
"'cause it's getting toward evening and we'll have to find a place to sleep."
The orc had not been gone more than a few minutes when they saw him appear on the edge of the top which was nearest them.
"Come on up,"
he called. So Trot and Cap'n Bill began to ascend the steep slope, and it did not take them long to reach the place where the orc awaited them. Their first view of the mountain top pleased them very much. It was a level space of wider extent than they had guessed, and upon it grew grass of a brilliant green color. In the very center stood a house built of stone and very neatly constructed. No one was in sight, but smoke was coming from the chimney, so with one accord all 3 began walking toward the house.
I wonder,
said Trot.
in what country we are, and if it's very far from my home in California.
Can't say as to that, partner,
answered Cap'n Bill.
but I'm mighty certain we've come a long way since we struck that whirlpool.
Yes,
she agreed, with a sigh.
it must be miles and miles.
Distance means nothing,
said the orc.
I have flown pretty much all over the world, trying to find my home, and it is astonishing how many little countries there are, hidden away in the cracks and corners of this big globe of earth. If one travels, he may find some new country at every turn, and a good many of them have never yet been put upon the maps.
Perhaps this is one of them,
suggested Trot. They reached the house after a brisk walk, and Cap'n Bill knocked upon the door. It was at once opened by a rugged-looking man who had
bumps all over him,
as Trot afterward declared. There were bumps on his head, bumps on his body, and bumps on his arms and legs and hands. Even his fingers had bumps on the ends of them. For dress he wore an old gray suit of fantastic design, which fitted him very badly because of the bumps it covered but could not conceal. But the bumpy man's eyes were kind and twinkling in expression, and as soon as he saw his visitors he bowed low and said in a rather bumpy voice,
"Happy day! Come in and shut the door, for it grows cool when the sun goes down. Winter is now upon us."
"Why, it isn't cold a bit outside,"
said Trot.
"so it can't be winter yet."
"You will change your mind about that in a little while,"
declared the bumpy man.
"My bumps always tell me the state of the weather, and they feel just now as if a snowstorm was coming this way. But make yourselves at home, strangers. Supper is nearly ready, and there is food enough for all."
Inside the house there was but one large room, simply but comfortably furnished. It had benches, a table, and a fireplace all made of stone. On the hearth a pot was bubbling and steaming, and Trot thought it had a rather nice smell. The visitors seated themselves upon the benches, except the orc, which squatted by the fireplace, and the bumpy man began stirring the kettle briskly.
"May I ask what country this is, sir?"
inquired Cap'n Bill.
"Goodness me, fruit cake and applesauce. Don't you know where you are?"
asked the bumpy man, as he stopped stirring and looked at the speaker in surprise.
"No,"
admitted Cap'n Bill.
"we've just arrived."
"Lost your way?"
questioned the bumpy man.
"Not exactly,"
said Cap'n Bill.
"we didn't have any way to lose."
"Ah,"
said the bumpy man, nodding his bumpy head.
"This,"
he announced in a solemn, impressive voice,
"is the famous land of Mo."
"Oh,"
exclaimed the sailor and the girl, both in one breath. But never having heard of the land of Mo, they were no wiser than before.
"I thought that would startle you,"
remarked the bumpy man, well pleased as he resumed his stirring. The orc watched him a while in silence and then asked,
Who may you be?
"Me?
answered the bumpy man.
Haven't you heard of me? Gingerbread and lemon juice. I'm known far and wide as the Mountain Ear."
They all received this information in silence at first, for they were trying to think what he could mean. Finally Trot mustered up the courage to ask,
"What is a mountain ear, please?"
For answer, the man turned around and faced them, waving the spoon with which he had been stirring the kettle as he recited the following verses in a sing-song tone of voice.
"Here's a mountain hard of hearing, that's sad-hearted and needs cheering, so my duty is to listen to all sounds that nature makes. So the hill won't get uneasy, get to coughing, or get sneezy, for this monster bump, when frightened, is quite liable to quakes. You can hear a bell that's ringing, I can feel some people singing, but a mountain isn't sensible of what goes on, and so, when I hear a blizzard blowing, or it's raining hard or snowing, I tell it to the mountain, and the mountain seems to know. Thus I benefit all people while I'm living on this steeple, for I keep the mountain steady, so my neighbors all may thrive. With my listening and my shouting, I prevent this mount from spouting, and that makes me so important that I'm glad that I'm alive."
When he had finished these lines of verse, the bumpy man turned again to resume his stirring. The orc laughed softly, and Cap'n Bill whistled to himself, and Trot made up her mind that the mountaineer must be a little crazy. But the bumpy man seemed satisfied that he had explained his position fully, and presently he placed 4 stone plates upon the table, and then lifted the kettle from the fire and poured some of its contents on each of the plates. Cap'n Bill and Trot at once approached the table, for they were hungry, but when she examined her plate, the little girl exclaimed,
"Why, it's molasses candy!"
To be sure,
returned the bumpy man with a pleasant smile.
Eat it quick while it's hot, for it cools very quickly this winter weather.
With this he seized a stone spoon and began putting the hot molasses candy into his mouth, while the others watched him in astonishment.
"Doesn't it burn you?"
asked the girl.
No, indeed,
said he.
Why don't you eat? Aren't you hungry?
"Yes,"
she replied.
"I am hungry, but we usually eat our candy when it is cold and hard. We always pull molasses candy before we eat it."
Ha ha ha!
laughed the mountaineer.
What a funny idea. Where in the world did you come from?
"California,"
she said.
California? Pooh, there isn't any such place. I've heard of every place in the land of Mo, but I never before heard of California.
"It isn't in the land of Mo,"
she explained.
Then it isn't worth talking about,
declared the bumpy man, helping himself again from the steaming kettle, for he had been eating all the time he talked.
For my part,
sighed Cap'n Bill,
I'd like a decent square meal once more, just by way of variety. In the last place there was nothing but fruit to eat, and here it's worse, for there's nothing but candy."
"Molasses candy isn't so bad,"
said Trot.
"Mine's nearly cool enough to pull already. Wait a bit, Captain, and you can eat it."
A little later she was able to gather the candy from the stone plate and began to work it back and forth with her hands. The mountaineer was greatly amazed at this and watched her closely. It was really good candy and pulled beautifully, so that Trot was soon ready to cut it into chunks for eating. Cap'n Bill condescended to eat 1 or 2 pieces, and the orc ate several, but the bumpy man refused to try it. Trot finished the plate of candy herself and then asked for a drink of water.
Water?
said the mountaineer wonderingly.
What is that?
"Something to drink. Don't you have water in Mo?"
None that ever I heard of,
said he.
But I can give you some fresh lemonade. I caught it in a jar the last time it rained, which was only day before yesterday.
"Oh, does it rain lemonade here?"
she inquired.
Always, and it is very refreshing and healthful.
With this he brought from a cupboard a stone jar and a dipper, and the girl found it very nice lemonade indeed. Cap'n Bill liked it too, but the orc would not touch it.
"If there is no water in this country, I cannot stay here for long,"
the creature declared.
"Water means life to man and beast and bird."
"There must be water in lemonade,"
said Trot.
"Yes,"
answered the orc.
"I suppose so, but there are other things in it too, and they will spoil the good water."
The day's adventures had made our wanderers tired, so the bumpy man brought them some blankets in which they rolled themselves and then lay down before the fire, which their host kept alive with fuel all through the night. Trot wakened several times and found the mountaineer always alert and listening intently for the slightest sound, but the little girl could hear no sound at all, except the snores of Cap'n Bill. End of Chapter 7.
Scarecrow of Oz, Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This chapter narrated by Kara Shallenberg. The Scarecrow of Oz by L. Frank Baum, Chapter 8. Button-Bright is lost and found again.
Wake up! Wake up!
Called the voice of the bumpy man.
Didn't I tell you winter was coming? I could hear it coming with my left ear, and the proof is that it is now snowing hard outside.
"Is it?"
said Trot, rubbing her eyes and creeping out of her blanket.
"Where I live in California, I've never seen snow, except far away on the tops of high mountains."
Well, this is the top of a high mountain,
returned the bumpy one.
and for that reason we get our heaviest snowfalls right here."
The little girl went to the window and looked out. The air was filled with falling white flakes, so large in size and so queer in form that she was puzzled.
"Are you certain this is snow?" she asked.
"To be sure. I must get my snow shovel and turn out to shovel a path. Would you like to come with me?"
"Yes,"
she said, and followed the bumpy man out when he opened the door. Then she exclaimed,
"Why, it isn't cold a bit."
"Of course not,"
replied the man.
"It was cold last night, before the snowstorm. But snow, when it falls, is always crisp and warm."
Trot gathered a handful of it.
"Why, it's popcorn!"
she cried.
"Certainly. All snow is popcorn. What did you expect it to be?"
"Popcorn is not snow in my country."
"Well, it is the only snow we have in the land of Mo, so you may as well make the best of it,"
said he, a little impatiently.
"I'm not responsible for the absurd things that happen in your country, and when you're in Mo, you must do as the Momen do. Eat some of our snow, and you will find it is good. The only fault I find with our snow is that we get too much of it at times."
With this the bumpy man set to work shoveling a path, and he was so quick and industrious that he piled up the popcorn in great banks on either side of the trail that led to the mountain top from the plains below. While he worked, Trot ate popcorn, and found it crisp and slightly warm, as well as nicely salted and buttered. Presently Cap'n Bill came out of the house and joined her.
"What's this?"
he asked.
"Mo snow,"
said she.
"but it isn't real snow, although it falls from the sky. It's popcorn."
Cap'n Bill tasted it. Then he sat down in the path and began to eat. The orc came out and pecked away with its bill as fast as it could. They all liked popcorn, and they all were hungry this morning. Meantime the flakes of Mo snow came down so fast that the number of them almost darkened the air. The bumpy man was now shoveling quite a distance down the mountainside, while the path behind him rapidly filled up with fresh fallen popcorn. Suddenly Trot heard him call out,
"Goodness gracious! Mince pie and pancakes! Here is someone buried in the snow!"
She ran toward him at once, and the others followed, wading through the corn and crunching it underneath their feet. The Mo snow was pretty deep where the bumpy man was shoveling, and from beneath a great bank of it he had uncovered a pair of feet.
"Dear me, someone has been lost in the storm,"
said Cap'n Bill.
"I hope he is still alive. Let's pull him out and see."
He took hold of one foot, and the bumpy man took hold of the other. Then they both pulled, and out from the heap of popcorn came a little boy. He was dressed in a brown velvet jacket and knickerbockers, with brown stockings, buckled shoes, and a blue shirt-waist that had frills down its front. When drawn from the heap, the boy was chewing a mouthful of popcorn, and both his hands were full of it. So at first he couldn't speak to his rescuers, but lay quite still, and eyed them calmly until he had swallowed his mouthful. Then he said,
"Get my cap,"
and stuffed more popcorn into his mouth. While the bumpy man began shoveling into the corn bank to find the boy's cap, Trot was laughing joyfully, and Cap'n Bill had a broad grin on his face. The orc looked from one to another and asked,
"Who is this stranger?"
"Why, it's Button-Bright, of course,"
answered Trot.
"If anyone ever finds a lost boy, he can make up his mind it's Button-Bright. But how he ever came to be lost in this faraway country is more'n I can make out."
"Where does he belong?"
inquired the orc.
"His home used to be in Philadelphia, I think, but I'm quite sure Button-Bright doesn't belong anywhere."
"That's right," said the boy, nodding his head as he swallowed the second mouthful.
"Everyone belongs somewhere,"
remarked the orc.
"Not me,"
insisted Button-Bright.
"I'm halfway around the world from Philadelphia, and I've lost my magic umbrella that used to carry me anywhere. Stands to reason that if I can't get back, I haven't any home. But I don't care much. This is a pretty good country, Trot. I've had lots of fun here."
By this time the mountain ear had secured the boy's cap, and was listening to the conversation with much interest.
It seems you know this poor snow-covered castaway,
he said.
Yes, indeed,
answered Trot.
We made a journey together to Sky Island once, and we're good friends.
Well, then I'm glad I saved his life,
said the bumpy man.
Much obliged, Mr. Nobbs,
said Button-Bright, sitting up and staring at him.
But I don't believe you saved anything except some popcorn that I might have eaten had you not disturbed me. It was nice and warm in that bank of popcorn, and there was plenty to eat. What made you dig me out, and what makes you so bumpy everywhere?
As for the bumps,
replied the man, looking at himself with much pride,
I was born with them, and I suspect they were a gift from the fairies. They make me look rugged and big, like the mountain I serve.
All right,
said Button-Bright, and began eating popcorn again. It had stopped snowing now, and great flocks of birds were gathering around the mountainside, eating the popcorn with much eagerness and scarcely noticing the people at all. There were birds of every size and color, most of them having gorgeous feathers and plumes.
Just look at them,
exclaimed the Orc scornfully.
Aren't they dreadful creatures all covered with feathers?
I think they're beautiful,
said Trot, and this made the Orc so indignant that he went back into the house and sulked. Button-Bright reached out his hand and caught a big bird by the leg. At once it rose into the air, and it was so strong that it nearly carried the little boy with it. He let go the leg in a hurry, and the bird flew down again, and began to eat of the popcorn, not being frightened in the least. This gave Cap'n Bill an idea. He felt in his pocket, and drew out several pieces of stout string. Moving very quietly so as not to alarm the birds, he crept up to several of the biggest ones, and tied cords around their legs, thus making them prisoners. The birds were so intent on their eating that they did not notice what had happened to them, and when about 20 had been captured in this manner, Cap'n Bill tied the ends of all the strings together, and fastened them to a huge stone, so they could not escape. The bumpy man watched the old sailor's actions with much curiosity.
The birds will be quiet until they've eaten up all the snow, he said. But then they will want to fly away to their homes. Tell me, sir, what will the poor things do when they find they can't fly?
It may worry 'em a little,
replied Cap'n Bill,
but they're not going to be hurt if they take it easy and behave themselves.
Our friends had all made a good breakfast of the delicious popcorn, and now they walked toward the house again. Button-Bright walked beside Trot and held her hand in his, because they were old friends, and he liked the little girl very much. The boy was not so old as Trot, and small as she was, he was half a head shorter in height. The most remarkable thing about Button-Bright was that he was always quiet and composed, whatever happened, and nothing was ever able to astonish him. Trot liked him because he was not rude, and never tried to plague her. Cap'n Bill liked him because he had found the boy cheerful and brave at all times, and willing to do anything he was asked to do. When they came to the house, Trot sniffed the air and asked, "Don't I smell perfume?"
I think you do,
said the bumpy man.
You smell violets, and that proves there is a breeze springing up from the south. All our winds and breezes are perfumed, and for that reason we are glad to have them blow in our direction. The south breeze always has a violet odor. The north breeze has the fragrance of wild roses. The east breeze is perfumed with lilies of the valley, and the west wind with lilac blossoms. So we need no weather vane to tell us which way the wind is blowing. We have only to smell the perfume, and it informs us at once.
Inside the house they found the Orc, and Button-Bright regarded the strange bird-like creature with curious interest. After examining it closely for a time, he asked,
"Which way does your tail whirl?"
"Either way,"
said the Orc. Button-Bright put out his hand and tried to spin it.
"Don't do that!"
exclaimed the Orc.
"Why not?"
inquired the boy.
"Because it happens to be my tail, and I reserve the right to whirl it myself," explained the Orc.
"Let's go and fly somewhere,"
proposed Button-Bright.
"I want to see how the tail works."
"Not now,"
said the Orc.
I appreciate your interest in me, which I fully deserve, but I only fly when I'm going somewhere, and if I got started, I might not stop."
That reminds me,
remarked Cap'n Bill,
to ask you, friend Orc, how we are going to get away from here.
Get away?
exclaimed the bumpy man.
Why don't you stay here? You won't find any nicer place than Mo.
Have you been anywhere else, sir?
No, I can't say that I have,
admitted the mountain ear.
Then permit me to say you're no judge,
declared Cap'n Bill.
But you haven't answered my question, friend Orc. How are we to get away from this mountain?
The Orc reflected a while before he answered.
"I might carry one of you, the boy or the girl, upon my back,"
said he.
"but 3 big people are more than I can manage, although I have carried 2 of you for a short distance. You ought not to have eaten those purple berries so soon."
Perhaps we did make a mistake,
Cap'n Bill acknowledged.
Or perhaps we might have brought some of those lavender berries with us, instead of so many purple ones,
suggested Trot regretfully. Cap'n Bill made no reply to this statement, which showed he did not fully agree with the little girl, but he fell into deep thought with wrinkled brows, and finally he said,
"If those purple berries would make anything grow bigger, whether it had eaten the lavender ones or not, I could find a way out of our troubles."
They did not understand this speech, and looked at the old sailor as if expecting him to explain what he meant, but just then a chorus of shrill cries rose from outside.
"Here, let me go! Let me go!"
the voices seemed to say.
"Why are we insulted in this way? Mountaineer, come and help us!"
Trot ran to the window and looked out.
"It's the birds you caught, Cap'n,"
she said.
"I didn't know they could talk."
Oh, yes, all the birds in Mo are educated to talk,
said the bumpy man. Then he looked at Cap'n Bill uneasily and added,
Won't you let the poor things go?
"I'll see,"
replied the sailor, and walked out to where the birds were fluttering and complaining because the strings would not allow them to fly away.
"Listen to me,"
he cried, and at once they became still.
"We 3 people who are strangers in your land want to go to some other country, and we want 3 of you birds to carry us there. We know we are asking a great favor, but it's the only way we can think of, except walking, and I'm not much good at that because I have a wooden leg. Besides, Trot and Button Bright are too small to undertake a long and tiresome journey. Now tell me, which 3 of you birds will consent to carry us?"
The birds looked at one another as if greatly astonished. Then one of them replied,
"You must be crazy, old man. Not one of us is big enough to fly with even the smallest of your party."
"I'll fix the matter of size,"
promised Cap'n Bill.
"If 3 of you will agree to carry us, I'll make you big and strong enough to do it, so it won't worry you a bit."
The birds considered this gravely. Living in a magic country, they had no doubt but that the strange one-legged man could do what he said. After a little, one of them asked,
"If you make us big, will we stay big always?"
"I think so,"
replied Cap'n Bill. They chattered a while among themselves, and then the bird that had first spoken said,
"I'll go for one." "So will I,"
said another, and after a pause a third said,
"I'll go too."
Perhaps more would have volunteered, for it seemed that for some reason they all longed to be bigger than they were, but 3 were enough for Cap'n Bill's purpose, and so he promptly released all the others, who immediately flew away. The 3 that remained were cousins, and all were of the same brilliant plumage and in size about as large as eagles. When Trot questioned them, she found they were quite young, having only abandoned their nests a few weeks before. They were strong young birds, with clear, brave eyes, and the little girl decided they were the most beautiful of all the feathered creatures she had ever seen. Cap'n Bill now took from his pocket the wooden box with the sliding cover, and removed the 3 purple berries, which were still in good condition.
Eat these,"
he said, and gave one to each of the birds. They obeyed, finding the fruit very pleasant to taste. In a few seconds they began to grow in size, and grew so fast that Trot feared they would never stop. But they finally did stop growing, and then they were much larger than the orc, and nearly the size of full-grown ostriches. Cap'n Bill was much pleased by this result.
"You can carry us now, all right,"
said he. The birds strutted around with pride, highly pleased with their immense size.
I don't see, though,
said Trot doubtfully,
how we're going to ride on their backs without falling off.
"We're not going to ride on their backs,"
answered Cap'n Bill.
"I'm going to make swings for us to ride in."
He then asked the Bumpy Man for some rope, but the man had no rope. He had, however, an old suit of gray clothes, which he gladly presented to Cap'n Bill, who cut the cloth into strips and twisted it so that it was almost as strong as rope. With this material he attached to each bird a swing that dangled below its feet, and Button-Bright made a trial flight in one of them to prove that it was safe and comfortable. When all this had been arranged, one of the birds asked,
"Where do you wish us to take you?"
"Why, just follow the orc,"
said Cap'n Bill.
"He will be our leader, and wherever the orc flies, you are to fly, and wherever the orc lands, you are to land. Is that satisfactory?"
The birds declared it was quite satisfactory, so Cap'n Bill took counsel with the orc.
On our way here,
said that peculiar creature,
I noticed a broad sandy desert at the left of me, on which was no living thing.
"Then we'd better keep away from it,"
replied the sailor.
Not so,
insisted the orc.
I have found on my travels that the most pleasant countries often lie in the midst of deserts, so I think it would be wise for us to fly over this desert and discover what lies beyond it. For in the direction we came from lies the ocean, as we well know, and beyond here is this strange land of Mo, which we do not care to explore. On one side, as we can see from this mountain, is a broad expanse of plain, and on the other the desert. For my part, I vote for the desert."
"What do you say, Trot?"
inquired Cap'n Bill.
It's all the same to me,
she replied. No one thought of asking Button-Bright's opinion, so it was decided to fly over the desert. They bade good-bye to the Bumpy Man, and thanked him for his kindness and hospitality. Then they seated themselves in the swings, one for each bird, and told the orc to start away, and they would follow. The whirl of the orc's tail astonished the birds at first, but after he had gone a short distance they rose in the air, carrying their passengers easily, and flew with strong, regular strokes of their great wings in the wake of their leader. End of chapter 8. Scarecrow of Oz, Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This chapter narrated by Kara Shallenberg. The Scarecrow of Oz, by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 9. The Kingdom of Jinxland. Trot rode with more comfort than she had expected, although the swing swayed so much that she had to hold on tight with both hands. Cap'n Bill's bird followed the orc, and Trot came next, with Button-Bright trailing behind her. It was quite an imposing procession, but unfortunately there was no one to see it, for the orc had headed straight for the great sandy desert, and in a few minutes after starting they were flying high over the broad waste, where no living thing could exist. The little girl thought this would be a bad place for the birds to lose strength, or for the cloth ropes to give way, but although she could not help feeling a trifle nervous and fidgety, she had confidence in the huge and brilliantly plumaged bird that bore her, as well as in Cap'n Bill's knowledge of how to twist and fasten a rope so it would hold. That was a remarkably big desert. There was nothing to relieve the monotony of view, and every minute seemed an hour, and every hour a day. Disagreeable fumes and gases rose from the sands, which would have been deadly to the travellers had they not been so high in the air. As it was, Trot was beginning to feel sick, when a breath of fresher air filled her nostrils, and on looking ahead she saw a great cloud of pink-tinted mist. Even while she wondered what it could be, the orc plunged boldly into the mist, and the other birds followed. She could see nothing for a time, nor could the bird which carried her see where the orc had gone, but it kept flying as sturdily as ever, and in a few moments the mist was past, and the girl saw a most beautiful landscape spread out below her, extending as far as her eye could reach. She saw bits of forest, verdure-clothed hills, fields of waving grain, fountains, rivers, and lakes, and throughout the scene were scattered groups of pretty houses, and a few grand castles and palaces. Over all this delightful landscape, which from Trot's high perch seemed like a magnificent painted picture, was a rosy glow such as we sometimes see in the west at sunset. In this case, however, it was not in the west only, but everywhere. No wonder the orc paused to circle slowly over this lovely country. The other birds followed his action, all eyeing the place with equal delight. Then, as with one accord, the four formed a group and slowly sailed downward. This brought them to that part of the newly discovered land which bordered on the desert's edge, but it was just as pretty here as anywhere, so the orc and the birds alighted, and the 3 passengers at once got out of their swings.
"Oh, Cap'n Bill, isn't this fine and dandy?"
exclaimed Trot rapturously.
"How lucky we were to discover this beautiful country."
The country seems rather high class, I'll admit, Trot,
replied the old sailor man, looking around him.
But we don't know as yet what its people are like.
"No one could live in such a country without being happy and good,"
she said earnestly.
"Don't you think so, Button-Bright?"
I'm not thinking just now,
answered the little boy.
It tires me to think, and I never seem to gain anything by it. When we see the people who live here, we will know what they are like, and no amount of thinking will make them any different.
That's true enough,
said the orc.
But now I want to make a proposal. While you are getting acquainted with this new country, which looks as if it contains everything to make one happy, I would like to fly along all by myself and see if I can find my home on the other side of the great desert. If I do, I will stay there, of course. But if I fail to find Orkland, I will return to you in a week to see if I can do anything more to assist you."
They were sorry to lose their queer companion, but could offer no objection to the plan, so the orc bade them good-bye, and rising swiftly in the air, he flew over the country, and was soon lost to view in the distance. The 3 birds which had carried our friends now begged permission to return by the way they had come, to their own homes, saying they were anxious to show their families how big they had become. So Cap'n Bill, and Trot, and Button-Bright all thanked them gratefully for their assistance, and soon the birds began their long flight toward the land of Mo. Being now left to themselves in this strange land, the 3 comrades selected a pretty pathway, and began walking along it. They believed this path would lead them to a splendid castle which they espied in the distance, the turrets of which towered far above the tops of the trees which surrounded it. It did not seem very far away, so they sauntered on slowly, admiring the beautiful ferns and flowers that lined the pathway, and listening to the singing of the birds and the soft chirping of the grasshoppers. Presently the path wound over a little hill. In a valley that lay beyond the hill was a tiny cottage surrounded by flower-beds and fruit-trees. On the shady porch of the cottage they saw, as they approached, a pleasant-faced woman sitting amidst a group of children, to whom she was telling stories. The children quickly discovered the strangers and ran toward them with exclamations of astonishment, so that Trot and her friends became the center of a curious group, all chattering excitedly. Cap'n Bill's wooden leg seemed to arouse the wonder of the children, as they could not understand why he had not 2 meat legs. This attention seemed to please the old sailor, who patted the heads of the children kindly, and then, raising his hat to the woman, he inquired,
"Can you tell us, madam, just what country this is?"
She stared hard at all three of the strangers as she replied briefly.
Jinxland.
Oh,
exclaimed Cap'n Bill with a puzzled look.
and where is Jinxland, please?
In the Quadling country,
said she.
What?
Cried Trot in sudden excitement.
Do you mean to say this is the Quadling country of the land of Oz?
To be sure I do.
The woman answered.
Every bit of land that is surrounded by the great desert is the land of Oz, as you ought to know as well as I do. But I'm sorry to say that Jinxland is separated from the rest of the Quadling country by that row of high mountains you see yonder, which have such steep sides that no one can cross them. So we live here all by ourselves, and are ruled by our own king instead of by Ozma of Oz.
I've been to the land of Oz before,
said Button-Bright,
but I've never been here.
Did you ever hear of Jinxland before?
asked Trot.
No,
said Button-Bright.
It is on the map of Oz, though,
asserted the woman.
And it's a fine country, I assure you, if only,
she added, and then paused to look around her with a frightened expression.
If only.
Here she stopped again, as if not daring to go on with her speech.
If only what, ma'am?
asked Cap'n Bill. The woman sent the children into the house. Then she came closer to the strangers and whispered,
If only we had a different king, we would be very happy and contented.
What's the matter with your king?
asked Trot curiously. But the woman seemed frightened to have said so much. She retreated to her porch, merely saying,
The king punishes severely any treason on the part of his subjects.
what's treason?
asked Button-Bright.
In this case,
replied Cap'n Bill,
treason seems to consist of knocking the king. But I guess we know his disposition now as well as if the lady had said more.
I wonder,
said Trot, going up to the woman,
if you could spare us something to eat. We haven't had anything but popcorn and lemonade for a long time.
Bless your heart, of course I can spare you some food,
the woman answered, and entering her cottage she soon returned with a tray loaded with sandwiches, cakes, and cheese. One of the children drew a bucket of clear cold water from a spring, and the three wanderers ate heartily and enjoyed the good things immensely. When Button-Bright could eat no more, he filled the pockets of his jacket with cakes and cheese, and not even the children objected to this. Indeed, they all seemed pleased to see the strangers eat, so Cap'n Bill decided that no matter what the king of Jinxland was like, the people would prove friendly and hospitable.
Whose castle is that yonder, ma'am?
he asked, waving his hand toward the towers that rose above the trees.
It belongs to His Majesty King Krewl,
she said.
Oh, indeed. And does he live there?
When he is not out hunting with his fierce courtiers and war captains,
she replied.
Is he hunting now?
Trot inquired.
I do not know, my dear. The less we know about the king's actions, the safer we are.
It was evident the woman did not like to talk about King Krewl, and so, having finished their meal, they said good-bye and continued along the pathway.
Don't you think we'd better keep away from that king's castle, Captain?
asked Trot.
Well,
said he,
King Krewl would find out sooner or later that we are in his country, so we may as well face the music now. Perhaps he isn't quite so bad as that woman thinks he is. Kings aren't always popular with their people, you know, even if they do their best they know how.
Ozma's popular,
said Button-Bright.
Ozma is different from any other ruler from all I've heard,
remarked Trot musingly as she walked beside the boy.
And after all, we are really in the land of Oz, where Ozma rules every king and everybody else. I never heard of anybody getting hurt in her dominions, did you, Button-Bright?
Not when she knows about it,
he replied.
But those birds landed us in just the wrong place, seems to me. They might have carried us right on over that row of mountains to the Emerald City.
True enough,
said Cap'n Bill.
But they didn't, and so we must make the best of Jinxland. Let's try not to be afraid.
Oh, I'm not very scared,
said Button-Bright, pausing to look at a pink rabbit that popped its head out of a hole in the field near by.
Nor am I,
added Trot.
Really, Captain, I'm so glad to be anywhere at all in the wonderful fairyland of Oz that I think I'm the luckiest girl in all the world. Dorothy lives in the Emerald City, you know, and so does the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and Tick-Tock and the Shaggy Man and all the rest of 'em that we've heard so much about, not to mention Ozma, who must be the sweetest and loveliest girl in all the world.
Take your time, Trot,
advised Button-Bright.
You don't have to say it all in one breath, you know, and you haven't mentioned half of the curious people in the Emerald City.
That 'ere Emerald City,
said Cap'n Bill impressively,
happens to be on the other side of those mountains that we're told no one is able to cross. I don't want to discourage of you, Trot, but we're almost as much separated from your Ozma and Dorothy as we were when we lived in California.
There was so much truth in this statement that they all walked on in silence for some time. Finally they reached the grove of stately trees that bordered the grounds of the king's castle. They had gone halfway through it, when the sound of sobbing, as of someone in bitter distress, reached their ears and caused them to halt abruptly. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of The Scarecrow of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 10, narrated by Gesine. The Scarecrow of Oz, by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 10, Pon, the Gardener's Boy. It was Button-Bright who first discovered, lying on his face beneath a broad spreading tree near the pathway, a young man whose body shook with the force of his sobs. He was dressed in a long brown smock and had sandals on his feet, betokening one in humble life. His head was bare and showed a shock of brown curly hair. Button-Bright looked down on the young man and said,
"Who cares anyhow?"
"I do,"
cried the young man, interrupting his sobs to roll over, face upward, that he might see who had spoken.
"I care, for my heart is broken."
"Can't you get another one?"
asked the little boy.
"I don't want another one,"
wailed the young man. By this time Trot and Cap'n Bill arrived at the spot, and the girl leaned over and said in a sympathetic voice,
"Tell us your troubles, and perhaps we may help you."
The youth sat up then, and bowed politely. Afterwards he got upon his feet, but still kept wringing his hands, as he tried to choke down his sobs. Trot thought he was very brave to control such awful agony so well.
"My name is Pon,"
he began.
"I'm the gardener's boy."
"Then the gardener of the king is your father, I suppose?"
said Trot.
"Not my father, but my master,"
was the reply.
"I do the work, and the gardener gives the orders, and it was not my fault in the least that the Princess Gloria fell in love with me."
"Did she really?"
asked the little girl.
"I don't see why,"
remarked Button-Bright, staring at the youth.
"And who may the Princess Gloria be?"
inquired Cap'n Bill.
"She is the niece of King Krewl, who is her guardian. The princess lives in the castle and is the loveliest, sweetest maiden in all of Jinxland. She is fond of flowers and used to walk in the garden with her attendants. At such times, if I was working at my tasks, I used to cast down my eyes as Gloria passed me. But one day I glanced up and found her gazing at me with a very tender look in her eyes. The next day she dismissed her attendants and, coming to my side, began to talk with me. She said I had touched her heart as no other young man had ever done. I kissed her hand. Just then the king came around a bend in the walk. He struck me with his fist and kicked me with his foot. Then he seized the arm of the princess and rudely dragged her into the castle."
"Wasn't he awful?"
gasped Trot indignantly.
He is a very abrupt king,
said Pon.
So it was the least I could expect. Up to that time, I had not thought of loving Princess Gloria, but realizing it would be impolite not to return her love, I did so. We met at evening, now and then, and she told me the king wanted her to marry a rich courtier named Googly Goo, who was old enough to be Gloria's father. She has refused Googly Goo 39 times, but he still persists and has brought many rich presents to bribe the king. On that account, King Krewl has commanded his niece to marry the old man, but the princess has assured me time and again that she will wed only me. This morning we happened to meet in the grape arbor, and as I was respectfully saluting the cheek of the princess, 2 of the king's guards seized me and beat me terribly before the very eyes of Gloria, whom the king himself held back so she could not interfere.
Why, this king must be a monster,
cried Trot.
He is far worse than that,
said Pon mournfully.
But see here,
interrupted Cap'n Bill, who had listened carefully to Pon.
This king may not be so much to blame, after all. Kings are proud folks because they're so high and mighty, and it isn't reasonable for a royal princess to marry a common gardener's boy.
It isn't right,
declared Button-Bright.
A princess should marry a prince.
I'm not a common gardener's boy,
protested Pon.
If I had my rights, I would be king instead of Krewl. As it is, I'm a prince, and as royal as any man in Jinxland.
How does that come?
asked Cap'n Bill.
My father used to be king, and Krewl was his prime minister. But one day while out hunting, King Fierce, that was my father's name, had a quarrel with Krewl, and tapped him gently on the nose with the knuckles of his closed hand. This so provoked the wicked Krewl that he tripped my father backward, so that he fell into a deep pond. At once Krewl threw in a mass of heavy stones, which so weighed down my poor father that his body could not rise again to the surface. It is impossible to kill anyone in this land, as perhaps you know, but when my father was pressed down into the mud at the bottom of the deep pool, and the stones held him so he could never escape, he was of no use to himself or the world than if he had died. Knowing this, Krewl proclaimed himself king, taking possession of the royal castle and driving all my father's people out. I was a small boy then, but when I grew up, I became a gardener. I have served King Krewl without his knowing that I am the son of the same King Fierce, whom he so cruelly made away with.
My, but that's a terribly exciting story,
said Trot, drawing a long breath.
But tell us, Pon, who was Gloria's father?
Oh, he was the king before my father,
replied Pon.
Father was prime minister for King Kind, who was Gloria's father. She was only a baby when King Kind fell into the great gulf that lies just this side of the mountains, the same mountains that separate Jinxland from the rest of the land of Oz. It is said the great gulf has no bottom, but, however that may be, King Kind has never been seen again, and my father became king in his place.
Seems to me,
said Trot,
that if Gloria had her rights, she would be queen of Jinxland.
Well, her father was a king,
admitted Pon,
and so was my father. So we are of equal rank, although she's a great lady and I'm a humble gardener's boy. I can't see why we should not marry if we want to, except that King Krewl won't let us.
It's a sort of mixed-up mess, taken all together,
remarked Cap'n Bill.
But we are on our way to visit King Krewl, and if we get a chance, young man, we'll put in a good word for you.
Do, please,
begged Pon.
Was it the flogging you got that broke your heart?
Inquired Button-Bright.
Why, it helped to break it, of course,
said Pon.
I'd get it fixed up if I were you,
advised the boy, tossing a pebble at a chipmunk in a tree.
You ought to give Gloria just as good a heart as she gives you.
That's common sense,
agreed Cap'n Bill. So they left the gardener's boy standing beside the path and resumed their journey toward the castle. End of chapter 10.